I was a warrior. I fought many great battles for the glory of our nation, for the honor of the dying samurai spirit. I was a hero.
Yo, Mr. Ozma is a sadist, man. So where do they put them in? Here and here, here and there. What about random? What a naughty boy. Put it in.
I later learned that my victories were unwelcome.
Hello, Baker here, or should I say elitist Baker, because I know I'm gonna be labeled as a kind of a bad guy for the things I'm about to say in this video. So just to be ahead of the curve, I'm just gonna label myself as an elitist before you guys can do that. So a few weeks back they released this Chaotic 24-man, and today I just wanted to talk about some critique surrounding said content, and more specifically bad critique. Because I don't want people to come out of this video thinking that I'm in some way absolving the developers of any critique. That's actually not my point at all. Rather, I aim to mainly just attack bad critique or shit critique, to be more blunt, which are, in my opinion, done in bad faith and are also misdirected in some ways. So I've basically got a bunch of talking points here, and I'm just gonna go through these one by one. So for my first talking point, I'm actually gonna use a clip by a fellow YouTuber named Level 7 Sloth, because I think he makes a decent observation here.
Having 24 people in the group instead of 8, for me, does not add anything to it. I'm not getting any more fun out of progging this with 25 people or with 8 people.
Now, that take he has, I think that's pretty valid, right? He's basically just expressing that, for me, this being 24 players doesn't add any value, and I think that's fair, that's a fair critique. I don't have an issue with that, really. However, let's be honest, whenever we see this point brought up by the larger community, it's usually not framed in this kind of way. Rather, they usually state it as some kind of objective truth, whether implying it indirectly or just flat out stating it. So, let's actually delve a bit deeper into this, because this is kind of interesting, and there are two ways of approaching this topic, really. One is asking, does the fight provide something unique by being 24 players rather than, the usual 8? And this is honestly kind of self-evident if you have actually done the fight, because particularly in the second phase, there were quite a few situations where granted we did it blind, but still we had to kind of approach mechanics in a very different way from the usual stuff, because there were 24 players and they had this weird groupings of 3 players thing going on. So I would say yes, they have accomplished this rather well. And in fact, if you look at this article where they interview the guy who designed the fight, Mr. Ozma, he actually does specifically say that yes, that was one of their goals. They wanted to make it different from 8-man Savage. So rather than just having taking an 8-man fight and scaling it up to 24 players, just triple everything basically, they actually wanted to do something unique with that. So when people imply that it is just, let's take a Savage fight, make it 24, I think that's bullshit. Pretty clearly, that's just blatant bullshit. And then the second point is essentially, does it being 24 players add any inherent value? So here we are talking about, does requiring more players add value in itself? And once again, I should like to think the answer to this is quite obvious, because it adds a social element, thereby increasing its value for those who value that social element, right? It's pretty obvious. Now, for you may not care about that, and that's fair. But I can speak from personal experience, because the way I cleared this fight was I essentially brought together a bunch of people. I utilized my FC, past players I knew through raiding. The other people recruited people through their own statics, stuff like that. So we had a bunch of, let's say, misfits kind of coming together, and we prevailed over this challenge. And that was certainly satisfying in its own right, in a way that's different from 8 players, in my opinion. And indeed, I even asked people about this in my group, after we cleared. I asked, did you enjoy it being 24-man? And the answer pretty much universally was that yes, they loved it being 24-man. So when people say that it being 24 players doesn't add any value and it's pointless, it does annoy me a bit, because who the fuck are you to say that? You know, that our group somehow imagined that we enjoyed it more because of it. You know, it does kind of annoy me. And of course, you know, you could say, well, what if we added 56 players? What if we added 2,000 players? You know, you can kind of keep going on and on, but obviously I would imagine it has quite diminishing returns at some point. Then it just depends whether, in your opinion, those diminishing returns already happen at 8 players, or 24 players, or maybe even at, you know, 50 plus. That's obviously where we start to see some variance in, you know, opinions. But I think saying that the fight having more players doesn't add any value, I think it's just quite rubbish, to be honest. I think that's a shit take, because once again, who are you to say that and dictate that for other people? Again, I want to emphasize, if you feel that you personally didn't feel that, okay, this fight having 24 didn't add anything for me, that's fair, you know. Or maybe you felt it didn't add enough value to make it worth your time. Again, fair. But just don't try to say there's some kind of an objective truth, because that's just rubbish. Now, of course, the reason they didn't find any value in it being 24-man is quite obvious. It's because they did it through PF, and when you do this fight in PF, it basically doesn't make a difference whether it's 24 or 8 players, right? And this is actually where a lot of the complaints stem from. It's from the party finder experience, specifically on NA/EU. So that's kind of what I want to address next, the party finder. And I do want to begin this with a question. You knew how difficult the fight was going to be. You know that because the developers literally told you multiple times. You know the issues that plague the PF, issues such as people rage quitting, and people lying about their prog, things of that nature. So you knew the issues of PF, and you knew how difficult the fight was going to be. So my question to you is simply, what did you expect? Did you somehow think that it being 24 players would make those issues of PF go away? Did you not think that it being 24 players would actually make those problems even worse? Not only that, once the fight came out and you tried to PF it, you got a shit experience. Wow, mind blown, right? So once you got a shit experience, you persisted. You decided to keep going and going in PF, and never thinking of alternatives, never thinking maybe you should just stop or whatever. You just kept going, and then now you're upset, and you basically take that out on the developers. Let's make one thing clear right now. This is not a fight issue. This is a community issue. The developers, in my opinion, are under no obligation to address any of these problems, because it's a you problem. You are responsible for addressing these issues, plain and simple. And I know that people hate hearing this because of this insistence that everything should be PFable. And I'm gonna say a very hot take here, but I think it's actually completely fine that this fight wasn't easily puggable. I know that that's gonna piss off a lot of people, but I personally vehemently disagree with that attitude, that everything should necessarily be easy to pug. I don't know where this idea comes from, that the developers are somehow responsible for, making that possible. They really aren't. Again, it's a community issue, and I'm going to treat it as such in this following segment. Well, you may then ask, what are the alternatives to using PF? As I see it, there are basically 3 options that you have as a PF alternative. One, be born Japanese and go do the fight in JP. Now, I'm going to assume this is not an option for most people, so I'm just going to move straight into number 2, which is create your own group. Now, I'm actually going to talk about this more extensively towards the end, so I'm not going to focus on that here. But the third solution here, which is in my opinion a really good in-between solution between, making your own group and PFing it, is instead of you PFing it immediately, you wait for one of these organized Discord groups to arrange the run, at a time frame that fits you, and you join these scheduled runs. They usually vary between fresh prog, maybe certain prog points depending on the fight, clear parties, and of course re-clears. So this is kind of a win-win. You pretty much clear the fight in a fraction of the time you would require in PF, and the re-clears are also very smooth, and it's honestly pretty low committal on top of it. The only issue really is if you have such a chaotic, no pun intended, schedule that you just can't do it, but from my experience that's pretty rare. Not a lot of people have that, so that would be, in my opinion, the best way to tackle these fights. Don't do it immediately, wait for one of these organized groups and go for it. This is on EU, but at least right now I'm seeing at least 3 servers that are quite active, and they are basically the same servers that would have typically done, you know, your BA and your DRS. So basically just join any servers that are doing those, and they will most likely be doing chaotic as well. The good thing about these groups is that most of them have been around for a while, at the very least since around the DRS days, maybe some even since BA days. So they've been running this thing for a few years, meaning they have the experience, you know, they know the logistics behind it, you know, organize it neatly and get it done efficiently. So they know all that. Plus they have always been very new player friendly, so yes, even though this fight offers bonuses for first timers, they have already been kind of doing that for ages anyway without the added incentives, so you know that they'll help you get the W when you join those groups. And like I said, it's very low committal. Pretty much all you do is you join the Discord, you probably get some kind of role, you sign up for the run. Some of them require a form to fill, but not all of them. And then you just show up on the arranged time and just join voice chat. You don't even have to speak, just be muted. And yeah, there's not really a lot to it. You do that and you basically, as I said, you clear in a fraction of times, your re-clears will be smoother, and you'll just have a happier time. So a somewhat frequent take I've also heard is that this fight will soon be dead content and nobody will be doing it. No it won't, honey. No it won't. You do realize that people are still actively arranging runs for both BA and DRS years and years after those fights came out? And you think this fight will somehow struggle for players when it has half the player count, has more incentives to rerun it for new players, more lucrative rewards, and doesn't require any extra hoops to unlock? Are you mad? I think what they mean to say is that the PF will die out. Which I say, good. The sooner that stinking shithole withers away, the better.
Burn. Burn. Let the whole star burn.
Then the only people left will be those who actually want to do the fight and help people out, not these entitled idiots that fester the PF. If I haven't made my stance on PF abundantly clear by now, I'm going to borrow the words of this wise British chap, and he can explain to you how I feel about Party Finder.
It's a fucking shithole! I hate the fucking place! I fucking hate it! It's full of dickheads! I fucking hate it!
Are we on the same page now? Good. Now, I know what people are going to say as a response to this, because people have been saying this since BA, and this also caused a stink when DRS came out, and they have also said the same thing now when this 24-man came out. People are going to say, oh, I shouldn't have to join a Discord group. I shouldn't have to use resources outside of the game. That's bad game design, or something to that effect. And like I said, this has been going around for a while, and honestly I find this to be a pretty smooth brain argument. I don't know how it keeps cropping up every single time. I honestly find it quite pathetic that the social element of MMOs have fallen so out of favor that people now see it as an actively bad thing, that the game developers try to get people to, you know, create communities, form their own, you know, social groups in order to tackle content. And I find this doubly funny because it's a pretty common complaint about FF14, you know, why aren't you guys doing more like open world stuff, or, you know, stuff where people have to come together to, you know, do something. And this is a big reason why, because you fuckers, every time they try to do something like that, they try to nudge players towards, you know, creating their groups, you guys complain about it. So it's kind of a no-brainer why they don't do more of that stuff. Really, at least to me, it's pretty self-evident. So quite frankly, in my opinion, this is just a shit argument. If you don't want to do the fight because it has that social element and you have to join a community, then this fight clearly wasn't designed with your interests in mind. Okay? Of course, that then brings us into the next topic, which is, why are people so invested? You know, why are people so upset? Why don't they just walk away if they don't like the content? Well, the word of the day is entitlement. And yes, I know what you're thinking. The big bad elitist brought out the E word, you know, I'm using the entitlement word. Yes, that's that's pretty much what we're going into next. Okay, so entitlement, right? I'm actually going to give you a little anecdote here. In 2017, they released this fight called The Unending Coil of Bahamut Ultimate, which was a pretty big deal at the time, and I'm sure you may have heard of it. Now, you may be wondering, well, what the heck does a 7-year-old Ultimate have to do with Chaotic? But just bear with me here, okay? This fight comes out, and a lot of people don't necessarily know what to expect. I mean, the developers tried to warn players that this was gonna be a rough one, but people kind of just chalked it up to, well, you know, he's just trying to hype this up, you know, Yoshida, he's always kind of just trying to hype up these encounters, and it's not gonna be that bad. Keep in mind that at the time, most players had only done like A12S or A4S, so that was the extent of most people's skill levels at the time. So at least my personal assumption going in was that it was gonna be another Neo X Death, you know, maybe a bit more difficult than Neo X Death. So the fight comes out and it kind of kicks everyone's ass a lot. It was pretty rough. It was quite brutal, I'm gonna be honest. And this fight really fucked anyone who tried to do it in PF especially. I remember I actually managed to reach Heaven's Fall Trio in PF, which was a pretty monumental achievement at the time for EU PF. But it was pretty bad, you know. You could have had Blackfire prog parties, and you might go an entire lockout without even seeing Bahamut once, or maybe you see him like once, you know what I mean? It was terrible, and so it quickly became clear to many people that this is just not feasible to clear in PF, not at least at this time. So what I did personally was that I started looking for a static in order to clear this fight, and sure enough, on my 8th static, and yes, you heard that right, 8 static, I finally managed to clear it, and it felt pretty awesome. But at the same time, you know, there were people who, when they saw how difficult this fight was, they kind of said, you know what, I'm just gonna focus on other things now, maybe do like Sigmascape, Savage or whatever, and they kind of, most of them actually put it on hold and then cleared it at the end of the expansion, or when Shadowbringers came out. Those some just gave up on Ultimates altogether, kind of just realizing, well, it's not worth the time investment for me. So the way I see it is that whenever players are presented with a challenge by the developers, there are 3 kinds of approaches usually you see people take, and I demonstrated 2 of them right here. So one was to basically embrace the challenge, you know, try to adapt and overcome it, and the second is to basically walk away, to, you know, say, this wasn't it for me, basically. And I think most people would agree that that's kind of what a well-adjusted adult would do, you know. You kind of prioritize things and you say, well, is this worth my time? Should I pursue this? And you might decide, I'd rather invest my time elsewhere. So I'm not bashing either approach. They're both valid, in my opinion. You rise up to the occasion or you dedicate your time elsewhere, okay? So you could kind of call this like a gamer version of the fight or flight response, essentially. But you may have noticed that I said there were 3 choices altogether here. So what is the third option then? Well, put simply, it's to complain about it. Yeah, when UCOP came out, there were actually quite a lot of people complaining about Ultimates. saying stuff like, oh, we lost the optional dungeon for this, or why are you guys developing all this stuff and these weapons only for 1% to be able to use it? It's a waste of development time, and really bad takes like that. And so you may wonder, what did the developers do with all this feedback of these people complaining? Well, they were summarily ignored, and honestly, thank goodness they were, because I think if Square Enix had actually listened to these idiots, I think that would have actually killed the raiding scene right then and there. And you know, there's one important area of game development. You need to figure out what feedback is worth listening to and what kind of feedback should basically be ignored. I mean, in an ideal world, yes, everyone's opinion counts, but I personally have never been a fan of that, especially in video games. I remember this was one of the reasons I quit old school RuneScape, because of the polling system they had, where basically for every single update they had to poll something, and you needed like a certain amount, I think it was 75%, for it to pass. And this sounds good on paper, but it just creates a lot of issues. I don't really want to get into that here. There are a lot of rubbish takes by people, and I think the developers have the right to ignore some of it, in my opinion, in order to make a better product. Because for the longevity of the game and the health of the game, it's not always for the best to listen to certain types of feedback, if you follow what I'm saying here. And this isn't at all unique to FF14, by the way. This is something that I have observed in quite a few games. It is a typical gamer response that whenever the developers try to challenge the players in some way, or they try to have you approach a situation in like an entirely new way, that gamers kind of default to, oh, it's bad game design, or this is buggy or something. Like, they don't understand it, so their first reaction is to basically complain about it and say that it's poorly made or whatever. And I will actually give an example of this happening in the chaotic, like a specific mechanic to which this applies later. But for now, yes, that's essentially the crux of it. In other words, they basically bash the developers when in reality it's just a skill issue, is what I'm saying here. So when I talk about a skill issue, let's say it's a mechanic in a fight, right? It's usually either the player doesn't fundamentally understand how it works, so they complain about it, or they lack the requisite skill to execute it, and once again they just default to complaining about it, rather than trying to overcome it and then judging whether it was of good design, essentially. And so the way I see it, all this complaining and moaning essentially stems from this mentality that just because I bought the game, just because I pay for the sub, that makes me automatically entitled to all the rewards within that game, which to me is just a very annoying attitude, because if you didn't work for it, you shouldn't be earning it, essentially. Get good. And I know what some of you are gonna say. You're gonna say, well, actually, it's not me who is having a skill issue, it's the other 23 players who are holding me back. And you know how many times I've heard this across my almost 10 years of raiding? You pretty much hear it all the time, you know. It's the other 7 people who keep screwing me over, I can't clear this fight, and stuff like that. And this is one of those hilarious situations where people way overestimate their own abilities. They kind of dismiss or downplay whenever they make a mistake, or, you know, selective memory, basically they kind of forget about it. While they also highlight whenever other players make mistakes, which is kind of natural in a way. But if you don't acknowledge that and you just say it's other people who are the problem, well, I hate to break it to you, but you are also a part of the problem. Yes, you, the person trying to clear this fight. It's not just the other 7 people. You are also making mistakes. And this is actually very easy to demonstrate, because whenever you see those clear for friend parties, you know, you have the friend who basically thinks that they are flawless at the fight and it's just the other people holding them back. Well, you put them in a group of 7 other people who have cleared it, and guess what happens 9 times out of 10, or honestly almost every single time? Well, surprisingly, it's the friend who is fucking up, who is now holding everyone back. I thought you were supposed to be flawless. I thought you didn't make mistakes, it was just the other people holding you back. Like, who would have thought that now it's that guy who is holding everyone back, because they were also a part of the problem, It's just now they basically get a free carry, but that doesn't mean anything.
So if there's a problem, you must be that problem.
So if you're gonna come at me with the whole, oh, it's the other people holding me back, it's not my skill issue, fuck off, honestly. Like, don't even try to come at me with that, because I have done enough raiding that I know this is a complete rubbish, and people who say this have just way too big of an ego. You are also part of the problem. Granted, when it comes to the PF, there is the issue of people lying about their prog, but once again refer to the earlier segment where I said the issues about PFing it in the first place. And you know, we could run a little thought experiment here. Let's actually try flipping this on its head, okay? Let's say that because I put in all this effort to organize, to schedule, to recruit 24 players, and went through the effort of clearing the raid that way, rather than someone who simply went into PF with no investment. I could say that because I put in all that effort, that I am more entitled for a smoother experience, that I deserve it more. Now, that's a giga elitist take, and I wouldn't necessarily say that to anyone. In fact, I actually sympathize with people who had to suffer through PF. But I'm just bringing this up to demonstrate how silly this whole entitlement angle is, and how it can kind of be viewed from two angles, essentially. Something I wanted to add regarding the rewards, it's also a good thing that for the most desirable stuff like the hairstyle and one of the mounts, you can simply purchase them with gil. So if this fight is too much of a time investment for you, but you still wanted that stuff, simply go earn the gil through other means. But I guess that requires putting in a modicum of effort, and people really hate that. And I kind of want to go back to that article I mentioned previously, because in it, Mr. Ozma talks about how during Endwalker, they were being a little too considerate of players when they were designing certain mechanics. So he uses the gorilla paddle in A5 as an example of a mechanic where they would look at that and say, we don't want to do this because the players would feel bad because they have to, you know, lose uptime. They can't be attacking all the time. So we wouldn't do something like that. And that kind of stunted their ability to develop interesting mechanics in a really bad way. So they now try to do a bit of a 180 on that. And they kind of want to take more liberties when it comes to this stuff. And I very much agree with that stance. I think that they really need to stop coddling players and instead just let them learn. To use an analogy here, you know, when you take the training wheels of a bike, and sure, you know, the kid might fall as a result and be a little upset when they get hurt, but in the long run they will be grateful for the fact that you did that as a parent, that they learned to do it properly. I kind of view it in a similar way here. And I do hope that is the approach they take with Chaotic going forward, because sure, there will be those loud individuals who are bitching and moaning, but that is only temporary. You know, eventually those voices will fizzle out. Because yes, those complainers are very loud, you know, much like a child when you say you can't have any more chocolate. They will want to make it everyone's fucking problem in that room, that they know that they have an issue. But the best way to combat that is to basically just ignore them, just ignore the idiots. Because much like that child, once they realize nobody is listening to them, they will basically run out of steam and move on to doing something else. So you basically just let the idiots complain at the void. You know, once they realize that nobody is listening to their entitled asses, they kind of just give up and move on to doing something else instead. So I think this is the best way to go forward. You basically stop coddling them, let them learn, ignore the idiots, and just keep going. And that's kind of what they have been doing so far, you know. They have been picking apart the good critique from the bad. So, you know, for example, they recently adjusted the rewards so that you can exchange the Demi Material 1 into 2s. So that's a good kind of critique. And they address that, and that's good. I just hope that this kind of complaining I'm referring to, that stems from entitlement, that they don't listen to that shit. And they kind of leave that in the rubbish bin because it really shouldn't be considered at all. So that's just my take on it, of course. Alright, so far I have been talking about, you know, entitlement and about how players have skill issue, you know, they don't understand how a mechanic works, yet they complain about it. I have been talking about that stuff so far, but I haven't given you guys any concrete examples, okay? I've been kind of just been talking broadly here. So that is what I'm going to do in the next segment, because I am going to talk about one of the biggest pieces of critique regarding this fight, which are the body checks. The criticism is basically that having body checks in a 24-player fight is bad, okay? Now I'm going to address that separately shortly, but some people take that one step further and they will actually claim that this fight requires basically flawless execution, that if even one player out of 24 mess up, you wipe on those towers, and I have even heard people call it an aggressive body check. I'm honestly astounded at how popular this take is, given that it's complete rubbish and shows a complete lack of understanding for how this mechanic works. See, the way these quote-unquote aggressive body checks work is they will basically deal a ridiculous amount of damage, something like 10 million, or they will give you debuffs that ensure that you will die to it. That is not how the towers in Chaotic work at all. These are actually very survivable through mitigation. And I can demonstrate this by showing you this.
Said you wanted more bombs next week, Baker.
You motherfuckers really hate me, huh? Notice how we're memeing and, you know, making jokes about the mechanic, all the while getting all these wound stacks. Does that sound like an aggressive body check to you? Seriously? If you want an actual aggressive body check, this is an aggressive body check.
This is massive. No, I'm fine. Why are you...
This is an aggressive body check.
Wait. Nah, someone was wrong!
The ones in Chaotic are not, and trying to claim that you have to play flawlessly is pretty dishonest and disingenuous towards the developers, who clearly put in a lot of effort towards making sure that these towers are actually quite recoverable. Yes, I would actually call this one of the most lenient body checks in the game, and honestly I would go even a step further and say this is a very well designed body check. Let me demonstrate what I mean here. So first thing that a lot of people may not be aware of, but the damage you take from the towers exploding is actually proportional to the amount of players that were missed in that tower. Now this is actually pretty unusual. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the first time we see a tower behave this way in a raid. So let's use an example here. The 3-man towers on the outer platforms. If one person is missing from that tower, so there are 2 players inside, it will actually deal quite negligible damage. It pretty much does nothing. But if all 3 people were to miss that tower, or let's say there are 1- and 2-man towers on the inside, if people are missing from those, they will deal a lot more damage. This is actually an interesting trade-off from a design perspective, because the people on the inside have an easier role, but they basically punish the raid a lot harder for messing up. Because again, if they miss like a 1-man tower, that's a huge amount of damage. However, the people on the outside platform have more mechanics to dodge, so they're more likely to screw up, but their screw up also doesn't cost the raid as much because the towers now won't do as much damage as they would have done on the inside. So this is actually pretty well designed. Secondly, they actually did something interesting with the LB generation in this fight. So there are 2 sets of towers, right? The first happens at the beginning of P2, and then the other one happens after the swap mechanic, where, you know, everyone gets shuffled around. They knew that the second set of towers would be more difficult to execute because it happens later on in the fight, so people are more likely to choke, but more importantly, it happens after the swap. So they knew that this would be harder for people to, you know, execute this properly. So what do? They basically ensure that you will have LB3 by the time you get there, and you can basically just send the tank LB3 and easily progress through it. They are quite literally giving you the mechanic for free. Like, there is pretty much nowhere else to use this LB on. So that's a very good game design in my opinion. And this is a little known fact, but you can actually reach the other outer platform from your own. So, you know, you can tank LB here and it will actually reach all the way here. But you do have to kind of stand on the edge for it to cover everything. So they clearly designed this mechanic around the tank LB3 in mind, because you can cover everything, and that's really cool in my opinion. And finally, I admit this is a much more nuanced thing, not many players know about this, but the way debuffs have worked in this game for almost every single boss in Shadowbringers is that whenever you debuff a boss, it doesn't actually just debuff whatever they are casting, they actually apply that debuff to everything that the boss is doing. So as a recent example, if you reprisal Brute Bomber during Fuse Field, it will actually reduce the damage from those explosions, which is very interesting. And this actually applies to the towers in Chaotic. Yes, if you reprisal, addle, feint, dismantle, whatever, the middle Cloud of Darkness before the towers go off, it will reduce not just the tower damage, you know, the mandatory, but also the explosions themselves. And I have picture proof of that happening here with addle. So this is very interesting, because now, if you just feint, reprisal and addle the middle boss, you will actually pretty much have a tank LB1 already just by doing that. But I do acknowledge this is like a lot more niche bit of information, not many people know this, but as I have presented all three of these facts, it may have come as a bit of a surprise to many of you guys, I would assume, which kind of demonstrates my point that the players have a fundamental lack of understanding for the mechanic, yet they so readily go ahead and complain about it, calling it, you know, an aggressive body check, or you have to play flawlessly to clear it or whatever, which is, as I demonstrated, this is complete bullshit. It's false. And what really gets me here is that it really undermines the thought process and the effort the developers put into making sure that this would actually be a pretty well-designed mechanic. They clearly took into account that there would be 24 players, hence there would be more room for error, so they designed that mechanic with that in mind and made it way more lenient and gave you more opportunities to, you know, make those plays and recover from it. And that's awesome. And then people come in and say that that is not the case really annoys me, because you are just blatantly wrong, you know. The tank LB3 example is especially egregious because in this very patch you have both an EX trial and an Unreal trial where it's commonplace to basically cheese a mechanic by tank LB3ing and mitigating it. So it's kind of disappointing to me that people didn't make that connection in the Chaotic somehow. I mean, really? And I know people are gonna scoff at this and be like, bro, you really expect people to be able to do that in PF? Not necessarily, but once again, refer back to what I said about PF in the first place. If you were a part of a dedicated group, this wouldn't be much of an issue. You know, you could just make the suggestion, hey, can we tank LB here? Sure thing. Notice how easy that is. This is once again an issue brought by PF and the community, not a fight issue. I want you to keep that in mind. Okay, but some of you may still remain unconvinced. So you might say, okay, the body check may be lenient, but I still fundamentally disagree with adding a body check in the first place. And this is a fair take, but I still want to give you my opinion on it. So let's actually consider what a body check is. It is basically a developer's way of saying you have to be coordinated when doing this mechanic. You have to actually execute it as a group, or there will be a punishment for it. Because, you know, typically when you have a mechanic, you yourself might die for it, you know, or you get a damage down or something, which obviously has, you know, wider consequences for the group in terms of recoverability or not meeting a DPS check. But, you know, by and large, it is only you who pays the price. But in a body check, the developer specifically says, no, this is now everyone's problem and everyone needs to do it correctly in order to, you know, get through it without any issues. Now, if the body check is particularly punishing, it will actually say one person making a mistake will completely wipe the group no matter what. This is what we see in fights like Pop, typically. But a more lenient body check, you know, like the one in Chaotic pretty much says, you know, you get some wound stacks for like 2 minutes, but if enough people mess it up or you're not prepared for it, you will still wipe and, you know, go back to the beginning. So, you know, this is obviously very debatable whether or not you consider this necessary, but I myself consider these kinds of body checks a necessary evil of sorts. and it actually makes for a pretty nice way to scale the content by difficulty. In fact, for those of you who have done all levels of content in this game, you may have noticed this. You know, extreme trials are not very punishing, early savage floors likewise, but you know, in say the final savage floor and especially ultimate, you'll start to see a lot more body checks, typically. And that's kind of how it has always been and how the developers like to, you know, scale the different difficulties of content. And once again, you know, you may fundamentally disagree with that, but me personally, I am a fan of it to some extent. Of course, it has to be done in moderation. I would argue that fights like P12S and Top went way too far in the way they designed their body checks, but that is obviously a topic for another time. But what I'm trying to say here is that having the body check is actually a good move in my opinion, because that is what differentiates it from regular 24-man. And I want you to actually think about this for a second, okay? What if this fight didn't have any body checks, okay? Would it be that much different from a regular 24-man? And answer me that honestly, like, would it actually be that different? And you'll probably find that the answer is no. It would actually be just a slightly souped up 24-man raid, which that may be what some people wanted, but that clearly wasn't what the developers aimed for and what they said when they advertised the fight's difficulty. You know, they very clearly said it would be somewhere in between EX Trials and like early Savage Floors, around there in difficulty. So, you know, in my opinion, the body checks are a necessity and were a good addition. Obviously, when you blow up in the moment, you kind of hate it, but I think it was, you know, a necessary thing to add to make it different enough from a regular 24-man. Another thing I want to add here is that I find it quite amusing how some people find these body checks completely disgusting, you know, they're the worst thing ever. But what's interesting to me is that some fights that people are really fond of, like DSR, people really love those fights despite the body checks. Like if you look at DSR, it's littered with body checks, like there's like a million towers and everything going on, and people love that fight. Now you might say, oh, but that's an ultimate, what does that have to do with chaotic? That's way too hardcore for what we're talking about. That's a good point. However,
I am Count Sidolphus Orlando. Your journey ends here.
Yeah, remember this guy? Yeah, it's fucking Orlando, and what's kind of funny to me thinking back is that if you were to ask people what is their favorite 24-man boss, this guy would make it pretty much everyone's top 3, if not, you know, their actual favorite 24-man boss ever. And for good reason, this guy was awesome. What some people may have forgotten is that before he was nerfed, he actually had a pretty big body check. There was this mechanic called Duskblade, which had 6 towers around the arena that each required 3 players. So you needed 18 players alive, or in other words 6 from each alliance, or you would pretty much die. And yes, it was that bad on release. If a single person was missing, it was basically a death sentence to anyone who wasn't a tank. And I distinctly remember this about the fight, you know, you pretty much, if you knew those towers were coming up and there were people dead, you could pretty much smell the wipe coming a mile away. It was pretty funny. And granted, you could say, well, the fight was nerfed. However, when people look back fondly on that fight, they typically do think of the unnerfed version. So it's just interesting to me that people seem to be so vehemently against body checks, yet they seem to love fights that had them. Now granted, in the Orlando example, yes, it was only 18 players, but that's quite brutal for a casual 24-man raid. I mean, that's huge. You know what I mean? So to summarize all this at the end here, not only did people fundamentally misunderstand why the body checks were necessary in the first place, they even completely misunderstood the specific body check that was put into the fight. And both factors combined show a complete lack of understanding for what the developers were aiming for with this fight. And that's kind of what I take issue with here, you know. When I read this comment about, oh, it's an aggressive body check, bro, the only aggressive thing here on full display is your ignorance. That's it. And you might say, well, DRS didn't have any body checks. However, DRS did have the whole, you know, you die and you might not get rest thing going on. So there was still a punishment factor in place. So it still kind of fits into my argument here regardless. And one other thing I want to rant about here is that there is this, I don't want to say common expression, it's a bit more rare, luckily, because it's such an idiotic thing to say, but I still seen some people claim that this content wasn't what they promised. You know, they wanted their definition of midcore content, and then they got upset when it wasn't what they expected. This really pisses me off, because they're basically implying that the developers were acting in a deceitful manner, you know, that they were tricking them somehow, and this is just blatantly not true. They made very clear what the difficulty of this content was gonna be. They gave you a comparison what it was gonna be, and they expressed this multiple times. So if you ignored what they said and you just went into it with your own imagination of what it was gonna be like, that is your own fault. The developers were not tricking anyone here. They were as transparent and as laser accurate about its difficulty as you can get. So this is just bad, honestly. Like, if you were saying this stuff, fuck you, honestly. This is just I'm sorry, it just really triggers me when people say stuff like that. It kind of reminds me of the Blue Mage situation at the end of Stormblood, actually, if you guys remember that, where you had these leaks coming out that there was gonna be this new job, oh, it's gonna be like Ninja again, yeah, it's awesome. And then they revealed that it was a limited job, and then people got really mad, you know, because they expected one thing and were given the other, but they never said it was gonna be a regular job, you know. They never said it was gonna be anything that it didn't turn out to be. So once again, this has nothing to do with the fight, this is just people being stupid and tricking themselves into thinking that they're getting something they're not. Now, of course, if your complaint is that you wanted midcore content, like let's say you wanted the relics this patch, the relic area or whatever, that is a valid complaint. However, once again, that has nothing to do with this fight. If you are taking that anger out on the guy who made the fight, the developers, that's just very misdirected, you know. That's just sending false signals, because you're basically saying that they were in the wrong for making this fight, which they are not. They actually gave people exactly what they wanted. People have been asking for harder 24-man content for a while now. So I take huge issue with that. Sure, we can discuss having more content like relics, but that is a discussion for another time. It has nothing to do with this. So I just wanted to make that clear. So to summarize everything at the end here, what riles me up and why I made this rant is it really just annoys me when people imply that the developers were deceitful, and or when people imply that the fight was poorly designed, when in reality it was just their own ignorance and entitlement speaking. And that's really my issue with all this. It's the bad critique, the really misdirected critique, and I wanted to address that here. Again, just to emphasize, I'm not saying that we shouldn't criticize the developers, not at all, I think that's great. However, I would implore people to do it in a more mature way, you know, like without insulting the developers, and at least trying to get the facts right first before you do it, and, you know, at least make an effort to understand what they were trying to do here. Things like that. As an example, you know, I recently watched Zepla's video about Dawntrail, and I felt that was pretty good critique, you know. I want to see more stuff like that, not these terrible rant kinds of critiques. Which is, I understand the irony, because I am ranting about it myself, but you get the idea. Now, you might say I'm being naive by expecting people to actually form decent critique on the internet, but the reason it feels disappointing to me is that I have noticed that the average FF14 player is quite a lot more mature than what I have seen in the communities of many other games. I can also see this reflected in the average age of my viewers. So yes, if this were any other game, I most likely would not be that invested in the matter. But because it's FF14, I do feel more compelled to speak up about it, and well, obviously the fact that I make content around it. And it really just makes me ponder, you know, what the fuck happened here? Where did all of these entitled man children come from? or were they always there, but the moaners have simply gotten more loud recently? Oh, we actually saw the enrage. Oh my god, guys, kill it! Kill it! Cloud Stripe! What is that achievement name, bro?
That's a good achievement name.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
Okay, guys, I have to do this fight again because I lost a Demi Materia too. My inventory was full, so I need the, Demi Materia.
I knew it was gonna happen.
I was looking at your fucking videos and your inventory was like, there's 2 slots.
Wait, was yours worse than mine?
He had 0 slots, or like 1 slot.
Oh my god.
I cleaned them up after I got caught out.
Lost 49.
Isn't the Demi Materia 2 the one that you also get a bonus of the amount?
Yeah, so
you're
you
not
lost
stupid.
49. Yeah.
When I lost 49 of them?
You've lost 49 of them.
What's the
Oh, why does it only say there? I thought I only lost 1. What the fuck?
How much do you get with him?
Okay, so this video has been quite negative so far, which I guess is kind of the nature of it being a rant. But I wanted to end this on a more positive note at the end here. So when I saw Mr. Happy's video about the first impressions he had on the fight, I was quite disappointed to see people pointing out, you know, like, oh, you're just privileged because you are a content creator, so you had an easy time to, you know, get people and such. And this is just complete rubbish. Like, this is just false as fuck. And how do I know this? Because I, myself, organized this event, and I did not use a single one of my subs or viewers in my recruitment. In fact, nobody even knows I cleared this fight amongst my subs until I guess now that I'm making this video. Of course, I did mention earlier that I have been raiding for a while, so you could say that I have the privilege of having a lot of contacts through my time of raiding, which is true to an extent. However, you honestly don't need that. And that's kind of gonna be my point with this final chapter in the video. You really don't need, you know, to be a YouTuber or have this huge contact of people. So in Shadowbringers, I made an FC event, basically, where I just recruited a bunch of people from my FC to run Delubrum Reginae Savage. And my thought process was basically, well, I have a raiding-oriented FC, and DRS, in my opinion, has some of the coolest mechanics in the game, so why not recruit a bunch of people and run this fight together? And it worked. We got some people outside of the FC, you know, like link shells and statics of people, but it was mostly an FC event. I then repeated the same in Endwalker, and I now repeated it with Chaotic in Dawn Trail. So I have a bit of experience doing this, you could say. And I remember when I was gonna set up that first DRS event in Shadowbringers, I was very skeptical. I was like, oh, surely no one's gonna show up and it's gonna be brutal to recruit all these people. But you'd be surprised at how many people, you know, when you just ask them, would you like to do this fight? Maybe they hadn't considered doing it before, or maybe they felt it was too much of a hassle, but they are eager to do it once you ask them. A lot of people are like that. And there is a kind of a compounding effect going on here as well, because you actually don't need to know that many initial people, because you'll notice that when you ask someone, hey, you want to do this raid? They'll say, sure. What starts happening is they'll go to their static and ask their static, you know, do you guys want to do this? And they might get like 4 people aboard from their static, or however many. So now you have 5 people when you only asked 1. Well, then you might notice that the people from that static might ask their friends, or their link shells, or their FC, and now you have more people. So you see what I'm saying here? You really don't need to know that many people. Rather, I think the real issue is people just have this general anxiety about, you know, being the raid lead. And certainly anyone who has played D&D know that there is this huge issue where everyone wants to be a player, but nobody wants to be a dungeon master, right? Because nobody wants to, you know, put in the extra time and effort. But I'm gonna tell you right now that it's actually not that bad with this type of content. In fact, it's way easier than something like Ultimate. You might think Ultimate is easier because it's fewer players. That's actually not the case. The difficulty of raid leading actually scales by how difficult the content is, not by how many players. You know, if I was to contrast my experience being a raid lead for Ultimate and DRS/Chaotic, their Chaotic experience was infinitely easier than raid leading an Ultimate, because that was a bullshit experience and a half. So yeah, all you really need is to take that first step, you know, take that initiative and say, you know, I'm gonna be the one to organize this. And I would imagine that most people watching this video, you know, they've been in an FC or are in an FC or been a link shell, or, you know, you've made contacts through like prior statics or your current static, you know. Most people have these contacts if they just start asking around, really. But of course, you know, if you're a completely new player or you just recently started raiding, it might be a bit more tricky, but I think it's still feasible to a certain extent. One thing I wanted to add here, and I can't believe I almost left this out of the video, but you can actually do networking through the PF itself. I was reminded of this when I read this post on Reddit, where this person basically said that they just started inviting a bunch of people from PF, you know, like people who were chill, that were competent, and he made his own little cross-world link shell around it. And eventually he had so many people that every time he went into PF, he already filled like half the group alone by just inviting those people. He basically had almost enough people to run an entire 24-man by himself. And I feel like such a dumbass for almost forgetting this, because I myself actually met a lot of people through this method. There were quite a few people I met all the way back in like Sigmascape and even Deltascape through PFing. You know, I would just meet these people and then I saw that they were kind of nice people, and then I would hit them up, you know, add them to my friends list, add them on Discord, you know, and then just go from there. So it's kind of crazy to think about, right? These have been my friends in the game for like 7 years, and I met them because of PF in the first place. I mean, that's kind of cool, right? Playing with people you met like 7 years ago and coming back to, you know, doing this content. I think that's what it's all about. So I would say this is actually a very good alternative if you don't have those contacts to begin with, you know, just network through PF itself, and you'd be surprised at the kind of people you may find. And that way you can begin to form, you know, that group, that social group of players to do this kind of content. What's also great is that when you organize it yourself, you get to make all the rules. So one big thing for me personally that I felt strongly about was that I wanted to make this blind prog, because I generally just enjoy blind way more than doing content regularly. And so that was a big thing for me, and I did, and we actually cleared it completely blind, and we got a pretty awesome experience out of that. I might make a video on blind prog separately, because I really wish more people gave it a chance. I think blind just makes most fights way more enjoyable than doing them normally. I wish it was more accepted or like common to do blind prog. But yes, you get to determine how, you know, casual it is, the schedule, you know, whether it's blind, mean item level, whatever. You get to dictate that. So that's also an added benefit. And, you know, some people might say, I don't have the time, or, you know, some other excuse like that. I really dislike an excuse like that, because, well, to go back to the D&D example, do you honestly believe that most DMs either get paid to DM, or that they're all some kind of needs who just have this infinite free time? No, most DMs are people who have a 9-to-5 job, but they arrange time, you know, they prioritize, and they make time for doing the activities they like. You know, just think about how much time people spend on their freaking phones, you know, and stuff like that. Just cut that shit out and try to make time for yourself. It's really not that complicated. And from my experience, you know, organizing stuff like this doesn't even take that much of your time, especially when it's something casual like the chaotic or DRS kind of a thing. It's really not that bad. And, you know, as an added benefit, I remember when we organized that Shadowbringers DRS run, and I think we had something like 28 players, and maybe like 20 of them cleared it. They were like first timers, and that just feels awesome, you know, when you helped so many people get their first clear, and especially when you were the one to organize that and make it happen. It definitely adds that extra feeling of satisfaction, in my opinion. Likewise in Endwalker, I think we had 16 first timers, and obviously in this chaotic we had all 24 players first timers. So it's awesome. So yeah, once again, I just wanted to encourage more people to try out, you know, being a raid lead and arrange this stuff for themselves. I know people have anxiety around it and people may think it's a lot of work, but honestly, just give it a chance, you know. You may be surprised. It's not that bad and it can be rewarding, so just give it a try, okay? Or don't, you know. I'm not your dad, who am I to say, but I would still encourage people to try it out. And because, in my opinion, this kind of a content is so much better when you have, you know, your own community doing it rather than the rubbish you have to deal with PF and such. So yeah, that's been everything, my little rant and the little song of hope at the end. I hope you enjoyed this one. Have a nice day.